Futures studies is the study of postulating possible, probable, and preferable futures and the worldviews and myths that underlie them. There is a debate as to whether this discipline is an art or science. In general, it can be considered as a branch of the social sciences and parallel to the field of history. History studies the past. Futures studies considers the future. Futures studies seeks to understand what is likely to continue and what could plausibly change. Part of the discipline thus seeks a systematic and pattern-based understanding of past and present, and to determine the likelihood of future events and trends. Unlike the physical sciences where a narrower, more specified system is studied, futures studies concerns a much bigger and more complex world system. The methodology and knowledge are much less proven as compared to natural science or even social science like sociology, economics, and political science. Overview. Futures studies is an interdisciplinary field, studying yesterday's and today's changes, and aggregating and analyzing both lay and professional strategies and opinions with respect to tomorrow. It includes analyzing the sources, patterns, and causes of change and stability in an attempt to develop foresight and to map possible futures. Futures studies and strategic foresight are the academic field's most commonly used terms in the English-speaking world. Foresight was the original term and was first used in this sense by H.G. Wells in 1932. Futurology is a term common in encyclopedias, though it is used almost exclusively by non-practitioners today, at least in the English-speaking world. Futurology is defined as the study of the future. The term was coined by German professor Asip K. Fleckheim in the mid-1940s, who proposed it as a new branch of knowledge that would include a new science of probability. This term may have fallen from favor in recent decades because modern practitioners stress the importance of alternative and plural futures, rather than one monolithic future, and the limitations of prediction and probability, versus the creation of possible and preferable futures. Three factors usually distinguish future studies from the research conducted by other disciplines. First, futures studies often examines not only possible but also probable, preferable, and wildcard futures. Second, futures studies typically attempts to gain a holistic or systemic view based on insights from a range of different disciplines. Third, futures studies challenges and unpacks the assumptions behind dominant and contending views of the future. The future thus is not empty but fraught with hidden assumptions. For example, many people expect the collapse of the Earth's ecosystem in the near future, while others believe the current ecosystem will survive indefinitely. A foresight approach would seek to analyze and highlight the assumptions underpinning such views. Futures studies does not generally focus on short-term predictions such as interest rates over the next business cycle, or of managers or investors with short-term time horizons. Most strategic planning, which develops operational plans for preferred futures with time horizons of 1 to 3 years, is also not considered futures. Plans and strategies with longer time horizons that specifically attempt to anticipate possible future events are definitely part of the field. The futures field also excludes those who make future predictions through professed supernatural means. At the same time, it does seek to understand the models such groups use and the interpretations they give to these models. History. Johann Galtung and Suhail Inayatullah argue in Macrohistory and Macrohistorians that the search for grand patterns of social change goes all the way back to SSU Marchen and his theory of the cycles of virtue. Although the work of Ibn Khaldun such as the Muqaddimah would be an example that is perhaps more intelligible to modern sociology, some intellectual foundations of future studies appeared in the mid-19th century, according to Wendell Bell. Comte's discussion of the meta-patterns of social change presages future studies as a scholarly dialogue. The first works that attempt to make systematic predictions for the future were written in the 18th century. Memoirs of the 20th Century written by Samuel Madden in 1733. takes the form of a series of diplomatic letters written in 1997 and 1998 from British representatives in the foreign cities of Constantinople, Rome, Paris, and Moscow. However, the technology of the 20th century is identical to that of Madden's own era. The focus is instead on the political and religious state of the world. In the future, Madden went on to write The Reign of George VI, 1900 to 1925, where he envisioned a large network of waterways that would radically transform patterns of living. Villages grew into towns and towns became cities. The genre of science fiction became established towards the end of the 19th century, with notable writers, including Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, setting their stories in an imagined future world. Origins. According to W. Warren Wagar, the founder of future studies was H.G. Wells. His anticipations of the reaction of mechanical and scientific progress upon human life and thought, An Experiment in Prophecy, was first serially published in the Fortnightly Review in 1901. Anticipating what the world would be like in the year 2000, the book is interesting both for its hits and its misses. Moving from narrow technological predictions, Wells envisioned the eventual collapse of the capitalist world system after a series of destructive total wars. From this havoc would ultimately emerge a world of peace and plenty, controlled by competent technocrats. The work was a bestseller, and Wells was invited to deliver a lecture at the Royal Institution in 1902, entitled The Discovery of the Future. The lecture was well received and was soon republished in book form. He advocated for the establishment of a new academic study of the future that would be grounded in scientific methodology rather than just speculation. He argued that a scientifically ordered vision of the future will be just as certain, just as strictly science, and perhaps just as detailed as the picture that has been built up within the last 100 years to make the geological past, although conclusive. The difficulty in arriving at entirely accurate predictions. He thought that it would still be possible to arrive at a working knowledge of things in the future. In his fictional works, Wells predicted the invention and use of the atomic bomb in the world set free. In the shape of things to come, the impending world war and cities destroyed by aerial bombardment was depicted. However, he didn't stop advocating for the establishment of a futures science. In a 1933 BBC broadcast, he called for the establishment of departments and professors of foresight, foreshadowing the development of modern academic future studies by approximately 40 years. Emergence. Futures studies emerged as an academic discipline in the mid-1960s. First-generation futurists included Herman Kahn, an American Cold War strategist who wrote on thermonuclear war, Thinking About the Unthinkable, and the year 2000, a framework for speculation on the next 33 years. Bertrand de Jouvenel, a French economist who founded Futurables International in 1960, and Denis Gabor, a Hungarian-British scientist who wrote Inventing the Future and the Mature Society, A View of the Future. Future studies had a parallel origin with the birth of systems science in academia, and with the idea of national economic and political planning, most notably in France and the Soviet Union. In the 1950s, France was continuing to reconstruct their war-torn country. In the process, French scholars, philosophers, writers, and artists searched for what could constitute a more positive future for humanity. The Soviet Union similarly participated in post-war rebuilding, but did so in the context of an established national economic planning process, which also required a long-term, systemic statement of social goals. Future studies was therefore primarily engaged in national planning, and the construction of national symbols. By contrast, in the United States, futures studies as a discipline emerged from the successful application of the tools and perspectives of systems analysis, especially with regard to quartermastering the war effort. These differing origins account for an initial schism between futures studies in America and future studies in Europe, U.S. Practitioners focused on applied projects, quantitative tools and systems analysis, whereas Europeans preferred to investigate the long-range future of humanity and the Earth, what might constitute that future, what symbols and semantics might express it, and who might articulate these. By the 1960s, academics, philosophers, writers and artists across the globe had begun to explore enough future scenarios so as to fashion a common dialogue. Inventors such as Buckminster Fuller also began highlighting the effect technology might have on global trends as time progressed. This discussion on the intersection of population growth, resource availability and use, economic growth, quality of life, and environmental sustainability, referred to as the global problematique, came to wide public attention with the publication of Limits to Growth, a study sponsored by the Club of Rome. Further development. International dialogue became institutionalized in the form of the World Futures Studies Federation, founded in 1967, with the noted sociologist Joan Galtung serving as its first president. In the United States, the publisher Edward Cornish, concerned with these issues, started the World Future Society, an organization focused more on interested laypeople. 1975 saw the founding of the first graduate program in Futures Studies in the United States, the MS program in Future Studies at the University of Houston Clear Lake, which moved to the University of Houston in 2007 and renamed the degree to Foresight. There followed a year later the MA program in Public Policy in Alternative Futures at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. The Hawaii program provides particular interest in the light of the schism in perspective between European and U.S. futurists. It bridges that schism by locating future studies within a pedagogical space defined by neo-Marxism, critical political economic theory, and literary criticism. In the years following the foundation of these two programs, single courses in future studies at all levels of education have proliferated, but complete programs occur only rarely. In 2012, the Finland Futures Research Center started a master's degree program in future studies at Turku School of Economics, a business school which is part of the University of Turku in Turku, Finland. As a transdisciplinary field, futures studies attracts generalists. This transdisciplinary nature can also cause problems, owing to its sometimes falling between the cracks of disciplinary boundaries. It also has caused some difficulty in achieving recognition within the traditional curricula of the sciences and the humanities. In contrast to futures studies at the undergraduate level, some graduate programs in strategic leadership or management offer master's or doctorate programs in strategic foresight for mid-career professionals, some even online. Nevertheless, comparatively few new PhDs graduate in futures studies each year. The field currently faces the great challenge of creating a coherent conceptual framework, codified into a well-documented curriculum featuring widely accepted and consistent concepts and theoretical paradigms linked to quantitative and qualitative methods, exemplars of those research methods, and guidelines for their ethical and appropriate application within society. As an indication that previously disparate intellectual dialogues have in fact started converging into a recognizable discipline, at least 6 solidly researched and well-accepted first attempts to synthesize a coherent framework for the field have appeared. Eleonora Massini's Why Futures Studies, James Data's Advancing Futures Studies, Ziadin Sadar's Rescuing All of Our Futures, Sahil Anayatullah's Questioning the Future, Richard A. Slaughter's The Knowledge Base of Futures Studies, a collection of essays by senior practitioners, and Wendell Bell's 2-volume work, The Foundations of Futures Studies, Probability and Predictability. Some aspects of the future, such as celestial mechanics, are highly predictable, and may even be described by relatively simple mathematical models. At present, however, science has yielded only a special minority of such easy-to-predict physical processes. Theories such as chaos theory, nonlinear science and standard evolutionary theory have allowed us to understand many complex systems as contingent and stochastic, making the vast majority of future events unpredictable in any specific case. Not surprisingly, the tension between predictability and unpredictability is a source of controversy and conflict among futures studies scholars and practitioners. Some argue that the future is essentially unpredictable, and that the best way to predict the future is to create it. Others believe, as Fleckheim, that advances in science, probability, modeling and statistics will allow us to continue to improve our understanding of probable futures. While this area presently remains less well developed than methods for exploring possible and preferable futures. As an example, consider the process of electing the President of the United States. At one level we observe that any U.S. citizen over 35 may run for president, so this process may appear too unconstrained for useful prediction. Yet further investigation demonstrates that only certain public individuals receive the appropriate social credentials that are historical prerequisites for election. Thus, with a minimum of effort at formulating the problem for statistical prediction, a much reduced pool of candidates can be described. Improving our probabilistic foresight. Applying further statistical intelligence to this problem, we can observe that in certain election prediction markets such as the Iowa electronic markets, reliable forecasts have been generated over long spans of time and conditions, with results superior to individual experts or polls. Such markets, which may be operated publicly or as an internal market, are just one of several promising frontiers in predictive futures research. Such improvements in the predictability of individual events do not, though, from a complexity theory viewpoint, address the unpredictability inherent in dealing with entire systems, which emerge from the interaction between multiple individual events.